Hello everyone. Today we're going to start with diagramming a sentence, and that sentence is my sister and I sleep very late. So I want you to please pause this video and then diagram this sentence and then play it and we'll check it together. Okay, let's talk about diagramming this sentence. My sister and I sleep very late. So remember, the first thing that we do, right now we're not having sentences with prepositional phrases. We'll get to that, reviewing that next time. But so the first thing that we need to do is we need to identify the simple predicate, which is the verb or verb phrase, and in this sentence we've got sleep. Now always check it to see if there is a helping verb with it. There is not, so we're going to write sleep, and it is an action verb. I'm going to put P for predicate. Now who sleeps? Sister and I. This is a compound subject. A compound subject. Now, in the last video, we talked about compound sentences. Is this a compound sentence? My sister and I sleep very late? No, it is not. A compound sentence is when you have two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. And to be an independent clause, it has to have a subject and a predicate and can stand alone. My sister is a subject, but no predicate. So it cannot stand alone. It's not an independent clause. This is another job, remember, of a coordinating conjunction is to just join two words to make a compound subject or a compound predicate or a compound direct object. So in this case, and is a coordinating conjunction joining sister and I into a compound subject. So sister is a noun, I is a pronoun. Subject of a sentence is always going to be a noun or a pronoun. They are both subjects. It's a compound subject, and we're going to put our coordinating conjunction on a dotted line here and to put C for conjunction. So now we have the main part of our diagram. Sister and I sleep. Now we can add our modifiers. Whose sister? My sister. So my is an adjective modifying sister. Now in some programs, they'll call that a possessive pronoun used as an adjective because it is formed from the pronoun me, but it is functioning as an adjective in the sentence, so we're going to call it an adjective. Whose sister? My sister. And I sleep, and now we have very late. Sleep when or sleep how? Late. So late is an adverb modifying sleep. And then late to what extent or how late? Very late. So very modifies late. Remember, adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. So now let's make sure we have the whole sentence. My sister and I sleep very late. Okay, let's go ahead and diagram another sentence. And that sentence is going to be, we have camped there often. We have camped there often. Okay, so go ahead and pause that and diagram the sentence, we have camped there often. And then push play and we'll talk about it. Okay, let's talk about this sentence. So our verb or verb phrase, so our simple predicate is have camped. Always check, because sometimes it's easy to miss those helping verbs. Have is a helping verb. You have a helping verb list. You need to go ahead and memorize that. If you don't have it memorized anymore, review it, because it is better if you can just automatically recognize these as helping verbs. So have is our helping verb. Camped is our action verb. That's our simple predicate. Who have camped? We. We is a pronoun. It is the simple subject. Okay, we have camped. Now we can add our modifiers. Camped. Where? There. There is an adverb. It's modifying camped. Camped where? There. An adverb modifies an adjective, verb, or another adverb. Camped when? Often. So often is an adverb. And this is exactly why we are learning to diagram. If you're wondering why are we learning this, it's because it helps you see these parts of speech, because you really have to think about where this goes. It helps you really think about how these words work together. Because if you were just labeling the parts of speech, it would be fairly easy to just go, oh, there is an adjective. But see, you can see when you put it in the diagram, oh no, it's definitely not an adjective, it's an adverb because it modifies a verb. All right, so let's read the sentence. We have camped there often. All right, now I want to talk to you about a concept that we talked about last year, and that is dependent clauses. So during the last video, I talked to you about independent clauses. And remember, independent clauses can stand alone. When you have one independent clause, it's a sentence, right? It can make sense by itself. It has a subject and a predicate, and it can stand alone. If you join two independent clauses, you have a compound sentence, and we talked about that last time. So, I like dogs, and just can't see that, and I like cats. In this sentence, we have an independent clause, I like dogs, and an independent clause, I like cats. We have joined those two clauses with a coordinating conjunction and. Remember, we talked about the coordinating conjunction. So the memory trick for that is fan, voice. Our coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. These are the conjunctions that can join two compounds or two independent clauses to make a compound sentence. All right, so we also talked last time about sentence fragments and how sentence fragments are not complete sentences. To be a complete sentence, it has to have a subject, it has to have a predicate, and it also has to make sense by itself or stand alone. That's what makes a complete sentence, or another word for a complete sentence is independent clause. So there are some sentence fragments that don't have subjects or predicates and don't make sense by themselves. So those are just, maybe it's a phrase, it's part of a sentence, so that's a sentence fragment. But there are some sentence fragments that do have a subject and predicate, and they just don't make sense by themselves. Like, because I swam yesterday. Because I swam yesterday. Let's look at that. Because I swam yesterday. It has a subject I and a predicate swam, but it doesn't make sense by itself. If I start a sentence, because I swam yesterday, you're thinking, because I swam yesterday, what? So it has a subject and it has a predicate. It doesn't make sense by itself, so it is still a sentence fragment. And when we have a group of words that has a subject and a predicate, but cannot stand alone, we call that a dependent clause. It's a clause. A clause is simply a group of words with a subject. Clause is a group of words with a subject and a predicate. With a subject and a predicate. That is what a clause is. Some clauses have a subject and predicate and make sense by themselves, and that means they're independent clauses. Some clauses have a subject and a predicate, but do not make sense by themselves. They are dependent clauses. Think about the word dependent. What does dependent mean? It means you're relying on something else or someone else. So a dependent clause relies on the rest, on something else to make a sentence. It's dependent on an independent clause to make a sentence. It cannot be a sentence by itself. It is not independent. It cannot be by itself. It depends on something else. So a dependent clause has a subject and a predicate, but it cannot stand alone. It has to be put with something else to make a sentence. And dependent clauses often begin, and I'm going to put this on Google Classroom so you'll see it in the handouts for this week. These are just some words that often begin dependent clauses. Words that begin, subordinate is another word for dependent, or dependent clauses. So these are some words that often begin dependent clauses. Subordinating conjunctions. Don't confuse these with the fanboys, the coordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions are words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since. You can read that whole list. If you see a word like that, then be aware that you might be looking at a dependent clause or subordinate clause. In fact, that subordinating conjunction is really what makes that clause dependent. Because I like swimming, for example. If we didn't have that subordinating conjunction because I like swimming, if we didn't have that subordinating conjunction because that makes us think that there's something else to come, then we would have an independent clause. If we took out that subordinating conjunction, we would have an independent clause. That subordinating conjunction is really serving the purpose of sort of connecting it to the independent clause, even though sometimes it does come at the beginning of the sentence. Because I like swimming, I love summer. Let's look at that. We could really switch that around and say, I love summer because I like swimming. So that because is a subordinating conjunction that serves the purpose of sort of linking or connecting it to the independent clause, even though sometimes it does come at the beginning of the sentence. Without it, we could have just an independent clause and we would have two sentences. I love swimming, I love summer. Or I love swimming, semicolon, I love summer. So these are our subordinating conjunctions right here. So become familiar with these. You don't have to memorize them, but become familiar with them so you recognize them. And then we have also our dependent clauses. Another type of dependent clause is an adjective clause. We'll kind of dig into more of these types later and how we diagram these. But just know also that sometimes subordinating conjunctions or dependent clauses begin with these relative pronouns. When they do, this relative pronoun actually is the subject of the sentence, like that is the cake that I made. There we have the relative pronoun that beginning this dependent clause. We have that is the cake as an independent clause and that I made as the dependent clause. And then it talks about noun clauses and some of the words that begin those. So just know these all, right now, just kind of remember these are all words that can begin subordinate or dependent clauses. They also have some other purposes. Some of them can also be used as prepositions sometimes. In that case, they would have an object of the preposition. We'll talk more about that later. So just what I want you to know today really is that we have independent clauses. They have a subject and a predicate and can stand alone. We have dependent clauses. They have a subject and predicate and they cannot stand alone. And if you remember, I think it was the last video. It may have been the one before that. I put on Google Classroom this handout about the different types of sentences. And And we're going to look at that now a little bit. A simple sentence is just one independent clause. That's easy to remember. A simple sentence is one independent clause. We also talked last time about compound sentences. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. A comma and a coordinating conjunction. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about complex sentences. And complex sentences contain one independent clause and one or more dependent clause. So if it has a dependent clause, it's going to have the word complex in the sentence type. If it has a dependent clause, it is a complex sentence or something called a compound complex sentence, which we'll get to in a minute. But if it has a dependent clause, it definitely is going to have the word complex in its sentence type. Complex sentence will include at least one subordinating conjunction. All right, so let's look at, and we'll learn how to diagram those later, but let's look at a complex sentence. When we take a trip, we listen to a book. Okay, when we take a trip, we listen to a book. So let's look at our different clause types in this sentence. And the reason we're doing this, guys, is because I want you to be able to recognize a few things. I want you to recognize a sentence fragment when it's a sentence fragment. I want you to be able to recognize a run-on sentence. And sometimes there are very long sentences that aren't run-on sentences. They're just long, complex sentences. They have several independent or several dependent clauses, but only one independent clause. It could have 5 dependent clauses and 1 independent and still not be a run-on sentence. So you need to be able to recognize that. And also, I want you to know to put a comma after an introductory dependent clause. So that's why we're talking about clause types. So let's look at this. When we take a trip, we listen to a book. So when should be a clue to you that you might have a dependent clause because it's a subordinating conjunction. So when we take a trip, yes, when we take a trip is a dependent clause. When we take a trip, it has a subject we, predicate take, but it cannot stand alone. When we take a trip. When we take a trip, what? So that is a dependent clause. Then we have we listen to a book. That is an independent clause. It can stand alone. So we have a complex sentence here because a complex sentence has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. One or more dependent clauses. So let's see if even if we add to that, if we add another dependent clause, when we take a trip, after we get in the car, we listen to a book. Then we have an a dependent clause when we take a trip, a dependent clause after we get in the car. Get in the car. We listen to a book. Should only be underlined once because that's an independent clause. Okay, we listen to a book. So when we take a trip, after we get in the car, we listen to a book. You could say, when we take a trip, after we get in the car, we listen to a book while we drive. While we drive is a dependent clause. It has a subject we, a predicate drive. It cannot stand alone because it has this subordinating conjunction while that's connecting it to the rest of the sentence. And we could even move this around and say, when we take a trip, while we drive, after we get into the car. So you could rearrange that. But again, we have one or more dependent clauses and one independent clause. So a complex sentence is one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. It helps if you're trying to sort out, maybe you're not sure, maybe you see a sentence, like when we take a trip after we get in the car, we listen to a book while we drive, and you think, gosh, that's kind of a long sentence. I think that might be a run-on sentence. Well, take that sentence and underline the dependent clauses twice and the independent clauses once. And if you only have one independent clause, then it is not a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is when you have two or more independent clauses strung together without your coordinating conjunction. And we will talk more about this later, guys. If you are a little bit confused by this, don't worry about it. You will absorb it as we go. Just listen and do your best, and you will get it. We will deal with this more. So right now, I just want you to understand that there are independent clauses that can stand alone. There are dependent clauses that cannot stand alone. A clause means that it has a subject and a predicate, and that a simple sentence is one independent clause. A compound sentence is two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. The trick for remembering the names of the coordinating conjunctions is fanboys. And then we can have a complex sentence, and a complex sentence is one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses, and we always put a comma after an introductory dependent clause. Now, if we have a dependent clause at the end of the sentence, if we say, we listen to a book while we drive, and that's our sentence, we don't need a comma. So we only put a comma after an introductory, that means it's at the beginning of the sentence. An introductory dependent clause has a comma after it. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about a sentence called a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence is just exactly what it sounds like. And it is on that handout as well. A compound complex sentence is simply a combination of a compound sentence and a complex sentence. A compound complex sentence has at least two dependent and two, actually it doesn't have to have it, can just have one dependent. A compound complex sentence has two independent, that's what makes it compound, right? Two independent clauses, and at least one dependent, which is what makes it complex. So it's like a combination of a compound sentence and a complex sentence. So it's basically like a compound sentence with at least one independent clause thrown in there too, because remember, a compound sentence is simply two independent clauses. Compound complex is two independent with at least one dependent. And this is all on your handout. So what I want you to remember really for today is that we have dependent clauses that have subjects and predicates but cannot stand alone. Those begin with subordinating conjunctions. Also, they begin sometimes with relative pronouns. And when we have an introductory dependent clause, you put a comma after that introductory dependent clause. And that is it for today. Thank you.